This is the Service APIs meeting for April 30, 2020. We're primarily focused on L4 and how it fits into everything today. Bowie, I know you had some thoughts. Anywhere you want to start off here?
Yeah, so part of I just want to lay out the sort of initial ground, and then probably, since it's the first time we've really talked about it, aside from some of the threads on the issues, I don't expect to resolve things today. But one of the hopes for sort of the new structuring of Gateway is that we could, and someone taking notes, I can add some stuff here.
Yeah, thank you to who's at it. It looks like somebody's already taking notes, so thank you.
Okay, so one of the hopes of the Gateway restructuring is to be able to capture things such as cluster IP or load balancer or what are the other forms? Node port. So basically the different flavors of service exposure via VIP are not, they're kind of, if you use the API to some degree, you'll find that it's very strange that there is this hierarchy of, if you have it goes like no cluster IP, node port, load balancer. And if you make it a load balancer, it actually exposes all those other ones as well. And then of course the service has all these things mixed into it. So one of the hopes was that if we could use Gateway and if it could represent L4, is to sort of be able to decouple a lot of that stuff. And the other one is clearly, if we can cover L4, it's a natural place for talking about constructing load balancers for exposing L4. And if you look at the original Ingress API, it actually was designed somewhat in a way to have L4 as part of it. You could see that it had an HTTP protocol block. It wasn't just HTTP focused, but it looks like also at the time there was just not enough energy to kind of populate that. So that's kind of where I want to start off with it. Now, in terms of the sketch, there were a couple of proposals. There's one that were penciled in the repo that's checked in terms of, okay, you have Gateway, which is going to talk about the same stuff as HTTP, and then for protocols that have additional routing, such as SNI, we have an appropriate route. There was some discussion about how the route for, let's say it's just like pure TCP, like you just expose pure TCP. Gateway seems okay. That's where you would define which ones were bound, and then the status seems appropriate. That it will allow you to discover what virtual IP potentially was placed on it. But the route seemed to be a little bit vestigial because there is no additional routing that is already done via the Gateway. So that was one API quirk, whether or not it would just be pure overhead. And then the other one was what sort of additional requirements we would see beyond the ones that we already had to address or have thought about for HTTP. And then with that kind of wide open topic, we can open it up. So a couple of ways we can approach this is, one is kind of get a feel for the folks who have looked at the current sketch, sort of what comes to mind in terms of immediate issues or whether it would work. And then the other one would be talk about additional requirements that you might see that might make it different than how the HTTP stuff is structured. And yeah, can leave it at that. So Rob, maybe it's worthwhile pulling up the current sketch just to walk through it with no
Sure,
expectation
yeah, I
that that
can.
is, going to resemble the stuff that is the final form.
So do you mean the actual repo with types or the original doc that sketched it out?
We can go through the doc and the sketch just real quick.
Okay. I always have to come back here, and I think it's. Do you happen to? I know we link it from the intro somewhere, but I guess it's even on the README itself.
I wonder if it might just be good to start with a focus on the cluster IP case. I mean, so what I've been thinking about a lot lately is what a multi-cluster service API could look like. And I put up a KEP and came and talked to the SIG network meetup a bit, but I've been working a lot with SIG multi-cluster. And it seems like Gateway as a representation of cluster IP would be a really good way to solve what it looks like to have a cluster IP-like concept across multiple clusters. And it's an interesting thing to try to express, I guess, with the way it's laid out today. So it'd be good to understand what that actually looks like.
Yeah, so Rob, you can look for TCP, I think, in this doc. Their extension. I guess there's not much description of it. So essentially the gateway would either point to, so we had a couple of just wild ideas here. One of them is that question would be what would go into a TCP? What would go into the route object for pure TCP, which seems like not that much. But then again, you can think about setting such a session affinity or attributes of TCP that don't make sense at the gateway level, right? Like attributes about the protocol itself. So we may want a resource representation for those kind of things. And then the other one that's very obvious is for TCP plus SNI, or TLS. That one is very obvious because there is an additional level of protocol matching. So
Right.
now, given the sort of TCP specific, like let's say session affinity, that does argue for having a resource there. And then we should, it might be a very small resource, like sparse resource, but it might not be useless, like completely empty. So the alternate proposal that some people had was to sort of like skip that link and then just drop a plain old service in there. I'm not super keen on that because it's a little bit too sort of like polymorphic and may get us into trouble.
Yeah. Also, like, what happens if it's not backed by a service? Like, what if the gateway should be pointing at something else?
Yeah, so that would be a challenge to describe. And then I think we might get into trouble where users will get very confused if there's settings on service that, like the interaction of all of them, when we go to evolve service in some form and having it linked directly.
Right.
So right now, it seems like the biggest gap is, and I think this is what you're talking about, is what comes after gateway. Like we know how an L4 gateway could look, but we don't really know what to route it to, like what a TCP route could look like, or what alternatives we could use to link to actual pods or endpoints in a cluster. Am I understanding that correctly?
So yeah, like the protocols that layer on top of TCP and UDP and so forth are pretty obvious because there is routing. For TCP, it's not as clear, but we can figure out like what makes sense there. I've seen a lot of some of the feedback, you know, is like there's just too many CRDs. So we do want to be like not create them if we can help it, but it does seem like to match the usage model, it might make sense to have one there. The unfortunate thing for the user is that it's kind of an empty thing if they like all they want is default. Because right now you create a service and then that's it. But in some sense, we are moving away from that model anyways if we want it to be more decoupled. Like the notion is that you create a service and that's your grouping, and then you would have something else that decorates, that sort of links to the service, that is how that service is exposed. And then I was asking around at the time that service was created, the support for having like lots of different objects linked to each other wasn't very good. So that's why there was a push to kind of just throw it into the same resource. But as you can see, the current service object, I don't think as a SIG, we want to recommend people adding lots and lots of stuff there because it is already kind of very complicated and sort of has too many responsibilities.
Yeah, case in point on the cluster IP, like it gets kind of weird. Like, what if you have multiple service ports, right? You have UDP and TCP mixed. Does that mean that the gateway has a listener for each service port that maps to a route for that service port? Like, how would that deconstruct?
Can you give a specific example?
I mean, let's just say I have a service with multiple service ports and I want to express the cluster IP with gateway. Like if cluster IP was a gateway class. How would so if I have multiple service ports and my service is exposed on multiple ports, then presumably I need multiple listeners on my gateway, right? One for each service port.
Yeah, so we have a notion in Gateway where the spec that you write is a request to the system. So that's how it actually works in Ingress, is that it's sort of like a set of constraints of what you care about. For example, if you don't care about a specific IP, you can leave that out in the listener block. And the controller would go and kind of give you an address. That's kind of how cluster IP works. You do raise a good point, is that what if your listener block does not match your service port exposure? It's sort of like duplicating service port.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, these two objects are completely intersecting in terms of service already does too much probably, and then we needed to do less.
Right. Like I actually think that multiple listeners on a gateway, like it's probably the right way to express multiple service ports. Like that seems reasonable.
This is leading me to maybe a higher level question of what value these set of APIs can add that core does not for L4. Like what can we express here that can't be expressed, or that is difficult to express with just the service?
So
I think the TLS routing for sure. I mean, that one for sure. straight
But for
TCP
L4,
and UDP. For L4, the question would be, can we use this to decouple service, or do we need to decouple service but on the side?
There's been a lot of like voice-based use cases with UDP and how that works that we've looked at that were just required more expressiveness. So definitely a lot of the kind of UDP-based things. There's all kinds of quirks that need config. That's been a little weird to try and think about putting that onto the service. There's just no other place to do it.
So
Also,
Mark,
like
with the UDP cases, are they routing based on the four or five tuple as a stream?
Yes. So either that or they wanted some sort of consistent hashing in other ways. Like actually, if there were cases, I think where, yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay, thanks.
I think
Mark, do
like
you
in
happen to
the,
have? Sorry, I
ahead.
was just gonna ask if you could share those use cases. Some of them that would be helpful as we develop UDP routing or whatever that happens to look like. Yeah. Sorry, Jeremy.
Yeah, no worries. I think like from the multi-cluster service standpoint, so what we've been kind of exploring is stretching the service concept across multiple clusters, and it seems like the right way to do that is not to just overload the service resource, because like we don't necessarily you don't necessarily want every multi-cluster service to appear to be a local service, and anything using the service API, if we just overloaded it, would for imported services into a cluster that were available or exposed from other clusters. I don't know that you necessarily want to just make them be automatically picked up by anything that supports the service API, but at the same time, like obviously a lot of the functionality you'd want to still be there, like a cluster IP. And so the current kind of approach we've been taking when exploring this has been like basically create a new resource that looks a lot like service and duplicates a lot of functionality, but most of the functionality that actually needs to be duplicated is really more in line with gateway. So if you could point a gateway at a different type of service equivalent resource, that could be awesome. Like if there was a way to basically associate, like really what I think what we need to do is really just be able to associate a gateway of class cluster IP with an arbitrary set of endpoints without having to create a service. That could be great. So if there was another resource, like a type of route that would allow that, then it would mean that we wouldn't need to introduce some new kind of multi-cluster service construct to still have the same kind of connectivity.
Yeah, I think one interesting point is that maybe it's okay. Like if our aim is to replace some parts of service, then worrying about overlapping service may be expected, because that is kind of what we're trying to do. That is worth, like, we should probably just write that down as it is okay to overlap with service, knowing that we are trying to overlap with service, because designing around the existing surface area is basically not the end goal.
Right.
So it might not.
You can't replace service if you don't replace service.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. There might be a UX question, like if you're duplicating fields, is there a way that we can make it infer from service if they're not provided, at least to start? Because like service hopefully will be replaced, but it will take obviously some time. And so saying like, if you want to use gateway with service, but you have to duplicate everything, might slow adoption.
Yeah, we had some discussion on Signet. I don't remember exactly which meeting, but like, would service be just the grouping construct? Or maybe it wasn't on Signet, there's been some other conversation. But like, let's say we limit service to just talk about grouping, and then we sort of push all the network exposure stuff up I think that's what you're talking about, Jeremy, is something
Yeah.
similar. I think what you're talking about is even getting rid of the grouping, but I'm afraid that that then leads to the same service. Like
I
you're
think
pulling up
grouping
service
makes
into
sense.
something.
I think the grouping makes sense. Like service, like that's what service describes to me. It's a grouping, right? And then we've also stuck a bunch of gateway type concepts on it. So as a grouping, it makes sense. But if all it was a grouping, then it seems like we could relatively easily create other kinds of grouping and still take advantage of all the gateway parts as now gateway is this separate thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
really the point is the service is fundamentally about grouping, and there are more types of grouping that we want, especially with multi-cluster.
Right.
Fundamentally, we don't want to get rid of the service or anything like that. The service still forms the function of grouping, and that's what we still need. And maybe the service needs to be enhanced to be able to do different, more advanced types of grouping, particularly maybe across clusters. But the gateway is really just about exposure and defining how the exposure is done from that grouping. And so I think that's what we're trending towards, right? We just need a way to figure it out that lands into the API this way.
I kind of want to also get some non-Google voices. I know we're having a conversation here, but
Yeah,
I would like to hear some outside thoughts.
trying to understanding when we're talking about services being used primarily or solely for grouping. So would that mean that a service would no longer kind of proxy to backend endpoints?
So I think the core API, it is what it is. Like we can't really change that behavior, but we see, so a couple of things are driving this. One of them is that we do see lots of complaints that service is overloaded. We do see lots of features that will be proposed and are being proposed. For example, there's a recent one about like IP protocol instead of TCP UDP. That if we keep trying to extend the service resource, it's going to be really ugly and probably very hard to define. The third thing is that sort of gateway is intended to be a rev of some aspects of service. And maybe we should just say outright that, hey, it's okay if we rev into the current surface area of service because we know service is already too big. So like those are the three things that I think are interesting to think about, because some of the stuff that we are designing for, if you try to make it so that there's very little overlap with service, it might not make it possible to say anything about TCP on this layer. So people who use service can still use service, right? It will still exist in its current form. Mm-hmm. But if you need the flexibility, you need the sort of like very nuanced exposure, like let's say you want a node port but nothing else, could there be a gateway way to say that using service just as a grouping mechanism, and then we kind of stitch everything together that way? That is one sort of API migration path. So the thing that came up, I think, in KubeCon last December or November is like SIGARCH was talking about no V2. Like service, one of the things is like, should we do a service V2 and then clean everything up? And this is one way to sort of do a V2 without actually removing the original service. Or it could lead to a V2 of service that is just grouping, and then you attach it to gateway and so forth. Does that make sense?
No, it does, and I mean I do agree that service is a little overloaded, and I do like the idea of using it as like a grouping mechanism.
As maybe a follow-up, is there any consideration, any worth in looking at a L4 gateway that does not use service at all, does not end up routing to service, has its own selection mechanism? I mean, essentially what, if I understand it right now, we're talking about maybe using service as a selector only, which selectors themselves are not particularly complicated. I don't know.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is there's, if we look at the constellation of different resources, so service triggers endpoints, triggers an endpoint slice, and then with the gateway consume service and you push the protocol bits out of service, what would still live in service? That would be an interesting question.
Maybe for Mark's UDP case, that would be really interesting, because if you want to do consistent hashing, then maybe it's helpful to be able to see the pods directly.
You do see the pods directly. Service is,
Oh,
I guess
you get
service
endpoint,
becomes
I suppose.
headless service. Yeah.
So I have a question with the like using gateway for like instead of service for exposing services. That makes sense. So I can see how it relates to node port. Services of type load balancer can be exposed via gateway. Should internal services, so cluster IP, be part of gateway? The current understanding is you would use gateways for exposing cluster like intra cluster things to outside world. Does like with in cluster traffic or in cluster communication, should gateway be involved in that? Like how are you thinking about that?
So I think the in out of cluster is a little bit, there is this, I think, unfortunately, there's like Kubernetes comes with a partial networking SDN-ish kind of model where there are certain sort of requirements that if it's a cluster IP, you can get to it from within the cluster. But there's nothing that prevents you implementing a cluster IP using a load balancer that just is in the SDN or like floats around. And then in that way, you could have a VM that's somehow able to reach that network, also be able to talk to the cluster IP. There's no, at least as far as I know, there's no like restriction that the cluster IP is somehow inside the cluster. And in fact, Kubernetes doesn't really talk about the network as much as it defines if things can be reachable and then how they can behave. So that's where I've found that the in a cluster, out of a cluster to be more something that results from how it was implemented. For example, you run kubeproxy on, you can run a kubeproxy on a VM and boom, you get cluster IP. It's just that it's like more rare than I've seen, but I've seen people do it. It can work. So that's where the in out of cluster distinction is a little bit blurry. The other one is that we've seen also people route internal service traffic to other services via a load balancer. Like, is that really in the cluster or out of the cluster? Probably not a big distinction there. And then the node port is actually, node port does fit because it is a way that people have been using to expose their services to outside. So in some sense, it is a form of gatewaying. So yeah, those are kind of how I see the current network setup in Kubernetes, is that because Kubernetes does not mandate an SDN and network connectivity, it doesn't speak of connectivity in the broader sense. Like, it doesn't model the network. It's harder to say there's some distinction between in-cluster network and out-of-cluster network.
I'll mention one. Someone brought up the fact of whether grouping could be done by gateway itself. I think the one area where that becomes really challenging is in that the services, you can change the label selector, but if you're doing like a percentage-based weight, the label selector is basically on or off for a given group of pods. And so you really need to have two services that simultaneously exist so that the gateway can do a % weight to both of them at the same time.
Just to,
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to comment about gateway and kind of its meaning. If we think about gateway from a networking standpoint, right, what is a gateway, right? It's to allow two hosts to communicate when those two hosts aren't on the same network. They can't communicate directly, right? So I think we can leverage that meaning of a gateway for service APIs, so that we say potentially a gateway is whenever you don't want two pods to communicate directly with one another.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, Mark. Yeah, I just want to add on to that is that this is also a natural way for us to get traffic split above service, because if you push traffic split into service, it sort of mixes up selection with, and then you'd have to have like some kind of sub-selection inside service. And that one is a whole topic in of itself, but it seems like we should stop at some, like there needs to be an atomic level at some point where you stop pushing things underneath it. At least it seems the most natural that we've seen for people who've used it.
Yeah, that's right. It would force us to do subsetting in the service. Yep.
Is there a better way to do like, I mean, if this is a new API, I've always thought of creating a new service for every subset. Like if you're trying to do traffic splitting and every subset needs a new service, that can be pretty maybe painful. I don't know. Are there alternatives? Like I hate to say subsetting, but I mean, is this a place we can consider other ways to do that? Like as has already been said, we don't want to design around service just for fear of overlapping it. If service may be too big in scope already. I don't.
Sorry, Rob. Was that? It seemed like you.
Yeah, Rob.
Your audio cut off.
Oh, sorry. My bad. Hopefully this is better. Yeah, my question was if we could, if now as we're rethinking how service interacts with everything and what role these new APIs play, I've always thought of traffic splitting using multiple services, like as an example, if you want to traffic split between different versions of an app or something like new service every time, that feels potentially painful. I don't know. It just seems like maybe this is an all right time to think of a different way to do selection. I don't know. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but it just because that's how it works now doesn't mean that's how it has to work forever.
Okay, so I think we're almost. There's like 5 minutes left, and I think this was a pretty far-ranging discussion. Oh, we're actually at time.
No, I think we got 5 minutes.
Oh, we got 5 minutes. So I think there were a couple of threads. Let's go through this. Notes. We should probably. The immediate problem is, let's just walk through some sketches. There's one in the repo. I don't know if it even works. We should figure out, okay, is this like a reasonable idea that we can pursue? And then we can sort of focus on a couple of use cases. One of the obvious ones are going to be, okay, I want to configure load balancer for L4. And then the other one is I want to configure a load balancer with SNI. that one seems more obvious to me and less problematic. And then see if the resource model works. And then the longer term aspiration for service, we should discuss, and in the broader SIG network, about putting that statement out there that it's okay to design an overlapping service, knowing that we are doing it intentionally, sort of as an experiment to see how much more decoupled we can make service. Thoughts?
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like, as far as API is concerned and as far as sketches of how these things could work, the answer, well, the missing piece is what comes between gateway and service. And so I guess we have a proposal for a TCP route, which is right now a mostly undefined type in our spec. But I'm assuming that is one of the key items we need to flesh out as part of any example, or similarly a UDP route. Does that sound right?
Yes. Like, it would be good to understand what people are staring at right now in terms of the thing that they want to do, and what would go in there. Like, would it be trivially empty, or are there interesting things, for example, traffic split or session affinity, that kind of stuff that could be attached there?
Yeah. Okay, are there anyone want to volunteer to take on any of these items for the next week or more? It seems like there are at least some types and some use cases that need to be explored further.
I think Jeremy is interested.
Sure. Yeah, I can take a stab.
And do we already
well,
have the issued for tracking this this effort?
Yeah, I don't see. Oh, James, you're on the call, but I don't see Andy, maybe, and then Jay. So there were a couple of folks.
Yeah, so there is this issue, which seems very related, but the scope of answering this issue is not necessarily designing an API. It's more just saying this is something we absolutely want to support, and that it would be core. But yeah, we could probably use some more issues. I had thought there was already a pull request or issue that basically added and proposed a TCP route, but I can't find that anywhere. And right now, all we have in types is just an empty TCP route type. So we have a type, it just doesn't have anything.
So Rob, I think that is a good issue to use 157. We could probably take some of the discussion, either drop it in the comments here and then start it off here. Okay. In terms of like, oh, this may overlap with service and whether that's okay, and then point people to this one, at least for that initial scoping.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, well, I guess we've reached time. Thanks everyone for coming out, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, I expect lots of conversations
that
will originate. So
yeah,
we will see lots of discussion.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye.